Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Undoctrinate Yourself. Today, I have a very special guest for you. This is Carrie Bennett. She is a really budding and incredible practitioner within the quantum biology space that I connected with more recently, and I'm really excited to learn from her today and have her share with us here on Undoctrinate Yourself. So, first of all, welcome, Carrie. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, me too. And I mean, maybe we can start by unpacking your journey into this space because I always love to hear about how everybody finds their way here. I feel like it's tends to be a winding path, but somehow like everything kind of culminates in this one area. So of quantum biology and light biology. So do you want to share your story with us?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I didn't just one day wake up and say I want to start, being a quantum biology clinician or educator, right? It wasn't a thing, right? It's thankfully it's a thing these days. But it really started with my own health journey. I had my first child about 13 years ago, and afterwards I experienced way more than what you would call the typical new mom, fatigue and things. So like I was exhausted all the time. I couldn't digest a thing. I had aches and pains. I had this awful combination of chronic fatigue and insomnia at the same time. And, I went so far as, getting a master's degree in nutrition, thinking that was going to solve all my problems, right? Before that, I had already been, a personal trainer, fitness instructor, certified massage therapist. I went to undergrad school, studied both micro and neurobiology intensively. So like I had a really good background in what I thought was all the necessary components of human health. And, I just was befuddled. I was like, and I had this deep knowing that I was missing something so foundational. I kept on getting this nagging feeling. And so one night I was scrolling on my phone, which I don't recommend anymore, thinking, what else do we have that do humans need to thrive, right? And I came across the words circadian rhythm in conjunction with a Dr. Jack Kruse blog. And at that moment, it was like this massive, I'm not going to say light bulb, I'll say sun lit up, illuminated my brain, right? And I dove super deep as I possibly could into the intersections between light and eventually with water, right? I found Jerry Pollack's work really quickly, and then also all the water biophysicists as well. And I started to apply a couple of key strategies using the concepts of light and water that I'd learned, and it made me feel phenomenally better in 3 days. And so I knew that this was a thing, right? That this was so important, and it's what was missing in my own health journey. And at the time, it also built up quite a clientele in terms of with all the different health modalities that I had specialized in, and I had been seeing more and more complex cases. And this clientele, then I started to apply these strategies with them, and they started to feel so much better. And so it just started there, and I'm so grateful for it because I feel healthier and younger and more vibrant, now 13 years later, than I did then, right? And so it's like it really truly is possible to take some pretty simple yet amazing information and strategies involving light and water and apply them regularly and allow your body to just regain homeostasis and thrive.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite things about this space and the people in it is that like there's not all this, oh, you need to spend thousands of dollars on supplements, you need to just spend all this money on things outside of yourself versus just kind of gaining access to the parts of yourself that are just in nature and just spending more time in nature and accessing what our species access for, millions of years. That it's just simple in a way. It doesn't necessarily mean it's easy always, but it is simple and typically the implementations or the interventions are also inexpensive, and so it is very accessible to people. And that's why it makes me really excited too, because there's a lot of people who need this information and this assistance who maybe can't afford to buy the devices and the supplements and everything. So I think it's ultimately empowering coming into the space.
Totally. I totally agree. It's one of those things where it almost sounds too good to be true. People sometimes need a device as like I call it like a gateway drug into this stuff. It's like, what red light do I need to purchase? Or like what blue blockers, or it's like they need this something to purchase in order to get them into just starting to apply some strategies that are free and easy.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a bit of a cultural thing too with the consumerism and just the way that
Mhm.
we're indoctrinated from a young age to like always think the solution is something that we don't have, that we're in lack of, and that we need to go get it, versus just kind of tapping into what comes naturally to us and what feels good. So I think a lot of this is also, I mean, for me, been also just like a reclaiming um, of my own intuitive understandings about what my body needs and like leaning into that versus constantly looking for answers from expert X, Y, and Z. So I think ultimately that's like the decentralized approach in general is like, as Jack Cruz says, like getting in touch with the guru within inside of you and allowing that to be your healer and your doctor. And I think that's ultimately a super empowering, and it could also be a scary message too, because some people are still in that consciousness that they want to be taken care of by a daddy figure or a mommy figure, and they don't want to do the work and they don't want to have the responsibility. It can be scary. Like I can personally say, I've always kind of been somebody who, let's say, had disdain for authority figures from a very young age. I had a lot of like traumatic medical stuff as a very young person. And so I always saw like the pitfalls of the centralized model. But then at a certain point, like if things start going wrong and you realize like no, there's nobody to save you but you, like that can be a lot. And of course, modern medicine has its place in like acute trauma and things like that. But I think when it comes to more chronic stuff, there's a lot that of responsibility that needs to be taken on by the individual that your nervous system needs to be prepared for. And that's also where the light story comes in, getting into a regulated space of like that balanced parasympathetic to sympathetic state so that you can critically think better, and getting out into nature more, just like enhancing your dopamine status so that you can navigate life in a more effective means.
Oh, totally. Totally. It's like people don't trust themselves. But what I've seen, and I love this because in my private community, I really get to see people over the course of years, right? A long term, long term, and their gradual applications and just awarenesses. And a very common theme is exactly what you're speaking to. It's the more I connect to light, to the earth, to nature, and apply certain strategies, the more my intuition, that little voice, becomes really strong. And that antenna, right? I describe our bodies as this gigantic water antenna. People don't realize that water is literally a broadband frequency antenna. And so if we do the things to strengthen that antenna, we start to receive the information and the downloads more strongly with more conviction. And then you hit the nail on the head. We don't need a guru. We don't need, to ask that person like, what supplement should I take? It's like, oh gosh, nowadays I don't have a ton of supplements, but every once in a while I'll open a cabinet. I'm like, that cell tissue salt is speaking to me, right? And it's like, I know what my body innately needs. And so I truly believe that as we get stronger in our connection to the signals that we're naturally designed to be around and strengthen that water inside of us, that's all you really need to do in order to allow those downloads and that information, that intuition, to get stronger.
Yeah, so maybe on that note, can we dive into water a little bit? So I've been studying a lot on the light piece for the past like several months. The water piece is I feel pretty comfortable with. I'm still really getting into like Mei Wen Ho's work, and I'm familiar with Pollock's work, but I'd love to hear your take on this space and like what are the powers that water has within our bodies?
Water, in my opinion, water is everything, right? The status of the water really dictates, and by status, we can talk about the energetic qualities, the minerals dissolved in it. We can talk about if it's being produced or not inside of the mitochondria efficiently. But basically, the status of the water inside of our bodies truly is everything when it comes to our body having adequate energy and information. Right. So that's what we really need, right? What does a healthy body need? Well, it needs enough energy in order to run all the programs it's designed to run. And it needs to have access to the correct information in order to know what needs to happen at any given moment. If any of those two things are off, the body is going to be in dis-ease. It's going to be out of balance. One of these things that we hear a lot is like, oh, it's like my body is failing me, or my body is attacking me. Like I have this autoimmune condition. But no, your body is not designed to attack you. It's not designed to fail on you. The signals and the information that you are providing it might be faulty, or you might not have adequate energy to run all of the programs your body is designed to run based on the information that it's receiving. And so if we really can simplify things when it comes to human health, it comes down to how's the water, which is the source of energy, and what's the information that you're providing your body. And the body knows what to do with that to bring everything back into alignment. So as I talk about water with people, everyone's always most concerned with, well, what water do I drink? What water do I drink? And that's never where I start with people. I say your body literally 999 out of every 1,000 molecules is water that you already have inside of you. Let's work with the water that's inside of you first, in terms of, we can talk about the exclusion zone water and also the water that's being made and recycled continuously in your mitochondria. And if we can improve those two things, then we can all bring the body back into homeostasis. Then we'll talk about the water that you drink.
Yeah, so let's dive into some of those strategies. So maybe
Sure.
you can define exclusion zone water briefly, and then we can talk about how to build it within cells and tissues and the benefits of that.
Yeah, sure. So exclusion zone water is a coined term by Dr. Jerry Pollack. He wrote a book called The Fourth Phase of Water, and he basically has found, and as have other beautiful water researchers, there's such a beautiful community of water researchers, have found that the water inside of us doesn't exist as we would think it was in a liquid state. So we think of water, and we're taught, I was taught maybe in the third grade that water existed in three different states: liquid, solid, and gas. And then as I went through my schooling, both undergraduate in more of the, molecular microbiology, instances, and then also in the nutrition, in my master's degree in nutrition, I was taught that the body and the cells had water, but no one ever explained to me that it was different than the liquid that we see in a glass. So my general assumption was that, okay, the water is there. Who knows what the heck it does? It might be needed so things can swim through it and, dissolve into and come out of it. So that water is needed, but it really doesn't play a substantial role in any aspect of our health or physiology. And unfortunately, water has been disregarded in so much research. From human health to biochemistry, it's very difficult for me to look at research studies these days that don't take into consideration the how the water behaves inside of us. And so what Jerry found was that the water inside of our bodies exists in a fourth state, and he called it a gel-like state. So picture jelly-ish, picture jello, right? Something along there, right? A state, but basically between a liquid and a solid. And so, you might think, well, that's cool, right? So what? Well, he went on to realize that gelled-like water forms next to all biological surfaces, right? All of what are called hydrophilic water-loving surfaces. And if you can picture a cell, it's fairly congested with water-loving surfaces, which means that the inside of the cell and the water-loving surfaces that surround the cell as well are all in this gel-like state. And it turns out that this gelled-like state has some substantial properties that make it different from typical liquid water in a glass. And those properties are really truly what makes this water inside of us so special. One of those properties that I'll highlight right now is that he found out that water holds a charge, right? It holds a negative charge. So if I were to measure charge, right? And the way I like to explain this is you got to do some chemistry math. Water is H2O. And so there's a certain amount of electrons and protons in there, and you kind of have to add up the electrons and the protons in water, and you would realize that water would be neutral, right? The electrons and the protons essentially cancel each other out. So if I were to stick, an electrode in here to measure a charge in liquid water, I would pretty much get a neutral charge, right? What he found was that when he stuck a little tiny measuring device called a microelectrode into the exclusion zone, this gelled water, it had a negative charge, which is substantial because, forever you'll read that the interior of the cell needs a negative charge for health. Oftentimes it's listed as pH, right? It needs a slightly alkaline pH. Well, another way to say pH is just an electron-rich environment, or alkaline pH. It's an electron or a negatively charged-rich environment. And so for the longest time, and I don't know how much have you dove into Gilbert Ling's stuff yet?
I'm getting there. I've been pushed in that direction. I feel like it's a rabbit hole. I'm not quite ready to go down, but I'm heading there.
At some point you have to, and we can nerd out on the side if ever you want to, because what basically for a very long time, the assumption was, and this is going to maybe ruffle a couple of feathers, but the assumption was that the cell maintains this negative charge because there's these pumps on the membrane that pump potassium in and sodium out. And this concentration of potassium in the ions inside of the cell that's maintained by these pumps gives the cell a negative charge. And so, lots of pumps have been invented over the years to explain basically the charge and what goes into the cell or what gets kicked out of the cell. And what Gilbert Ling and then Jerry Pollack's work has shown is that what if the water was never neutral in the first place. And so we didn't need all these pumps to explain the charge of the cell. And now we know that it's the water, the potassium that is a main intracellular mineral, and the water that surrounds it that is the source of the charge, and that potassium doesn't need a pump. Actually, there's other means of explaining that. And this was just such an earth-shattering, simplifying effect, like concept for me to be like, gosh, could it really be that simple? And the question is yes, or the answer is yes. That's the question. The answer is yes, it can be. And so we know that if a cell is all of a sudden lacks this negative charge, that cell starts to become dysfunctional. And that cell could at some point drop the negative charge to a critical threshold where it actually begins to divide uncontrollably. And that uncontrollable cell division can at some point, it can be malignant. It may be benign as well. But we know that cellular water, it legitimately isn't a source of this healthy charge. And beyond that, and I know you're aware of this, Alexis, but beyond that, Dr. Pollack's lab went a step further. They said, well, if this water gets this negative charge, what's happening? Typically it's neutral. So where did that one proton go that would have balanced it out? Where'd that proton go? That proton got kicked out and forms as a line of positive charge right next to the negative charge. So here you now have a biological surface with this negatively charged exclusion zone, or EZ water, and what's now called the proton zone, which is positively charged. And Pollack's lab showed that if you stick a little microelectrode in the positive proton zone and one in the negatively charged exclusion zone and connect it to a light bulb, you light the light bulb. Right? So that means we literally have electricity. We literally have the capacity to do work inside of our cells solely through how water behaves. And, you know, it's cool, right? There's nothing more you can say, except it's super cool. And it really simplifies health, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, when that piece was made clear to me, I had a lot of quote unquote light bulbs going off in my head, because I remember in undergrad and even in grad school being taught about ATP biology and how, you know, ATP provides free energy, and it never sat right with me because I'm like, what is free energy? Like, what is actually happening? And when I learned that, okay, maybe we have this ATP that's donating a phosphoryl group that's changing the shape of an enzyme that's allowing water to move into active sites to allow that actual biochemistry to happen, to allow the enzymatic conversions to happen, like that made perfect sense to me. Because like if ATP is just involved in changing the shape of things to allow water to do the work that it can do, now that is very easily visualizable, versus ATP just providing this nebulous free energy that's like magic, woo woo, something's happening, and then it's just, the reaction's just going. But no, the water model is just, it makes complete sense. And it also then comes back to the importance of, I mean, the light piece and anything that we're doing to build that gel state water in our bodies, because without that, we're basically a battery that's dying.
100%. That's exactly what we are. And that the cool part about that water is, as you said, yes, it basically helps proteins keep their correct shape, but it goes beyond that, because water is so cool. Water can do something called phase shift, or do phase transitions, meaning, yes, and so in certain instances, we want proteins in their elongated form. And that the responsibility of ATP is essentially to kind of unwind it so that water can hold, this gelled water can really hold a certain shape to a protein. So you can hold it in this elongated shape. And that allows for semiconduction, and it allows for a lot of things to happen through the proteins and the enzymes and things like you implied to do work. But water, when you also give it a correct signal, it can literally change that water to what's called the bulk water, or water that's more in a liquid state. And so now that protein becomes inactive, right? Or that enzyme site becomes inactive. It's not needed because the water is now not holding it anymore. And it's just this idea of, do we have mitochondria making ATP adequately enough with the water as well for those proteins to be able to unfold? And then are we giving the body the signals so that this protein knows when to be disactivated or inactive versus when it needs to be active? And so simple that water can do all of that. And it really comes down, again, are we giving the body the correct information signals so water can do the task for us?
And that's also making me think, at Princeton, when I was there doing my PhD studies, Cliff Brangwine, who's like this big lab there, he got this huge prize. I don't remember the name of the prize, some, you know, lofty scientific recognition for the discovery of phase transition among like enzyme complexes, let's say. But now, you know, revisiting that research, I'm sure it's likely a story of water and not really the molecular biology story that he has kind of that has been his claim to fame. So I think it's really interesting to revisit all of like the work, let's say from the past couple decades in molecular biology through this lens of like light and water. And I think we just have an incredible amount to learn by doing that.
Oh yeah, 100%, right? Like I want to give all of these researchers that you're like the ones that you're describing credit, right? Because they're doing good work based on the information that they know. But just imagine if these researchers take into consideration the properties of water. I mean, we could literally reframe everything through the lens of water, and how amazing if this word gets out there that so that we can actually learn way more accurately about what's happening in the body as opposed to some, some theories, right, about what might be happening through that biochemical and the molecular mechanism lens. So, let's get this message out there so that the true research that we want to see done is done on this. I'd love more research done through the lens of water.
Yeah, and I think one of the big ones is like because we know that mitochondria are specifically making deuterium depleted water, then doing the research on exclusion zone. And I know Jack has talked about this with Pollock's work, like he really wants it to be done with deuterium depleted water to see, is exclusion zone formed more readily in that state, in that water state. So I
Did
think
you hear? I mean, are you familiar with Stephanie Seneff and her
I
hypothesis on that?
I'm familiar with her name, but I don't know her hypothesis on that, no.
Well, this makes sense to me, right? And it's actually that exclusion zone water has the ability to sequester deuterium because its
Mm.
binding capacity when you have a deuterium, right? That affinity for oxygen in the exclusion zone lattice, and we can talk about what that means to the listeners, but that hydrogen has about a 10 times greater affinity for the oxygen. So it makes sense that the exclusion zone water can sequester deuterium where it's not going to be biologically harmful, and when it'll kick out a proteome, for example, so that it can be in the mitochondrial intermembrane space. We can have a proteome there, which is what the type of proton we want to have, right? The type of hydrogen we want to have there. And so I am a firm believer that part of the reason why building exclusion zone water and doing strategies that we can talk about to maintain it in the body is so important is because it gives us the opportunity to hold deuterium where it's not going to be harmful, right?
That would actually make a ton of sense. So yeah, maybe on that note, let's talk about how we can rebuild and maintain the exclusion zone status of our cells and tissues.
Sure, sure. So the cool research coming out of Jerry's lab was, and have you ever interviewed Jerry yet?
Not yet.
Oh, do it. He's the coolest dude ever. But he's got what I would imagine to be a lovely laboratory, and just a lot of free thinkers. He lets his students really kind of think and explore outside of the box. And one of his students was basically measuring exclusion zones in a petri dish. And the way that was done is you take a membrane that mimics a biological surface called Nafion and a glass of water where there's tiny little black beads in them. They're called microspheres. And you essentially pour this water with these spheres into the petri dish. And what you'll see forming, the reason it's called exclusion zone in the first place, is you'll actually see a space next to the Nafion membrane, but like a biological surface, where none of the spheres can penetrate. It's a clear zone. And that clear zone, that's why they called it exclusion zone, because literally it's excluding things from penetrating it. It's excluding those microspheres away from the biological surface. And so while they were studying this in the lab, one of the students apparently shined a light bulb, like an incandescent bulb, on the petri dish and came back, I don't know how much, let's say a little while later, and all of a sudden the exclusion zone expanded. It grew, meaning something from that light was causing the exclusion zone to get bigger. And, after lots of studies on that, they found that it really truly was the infrared, the heat-based portion of that light that causes the exclusion zone to grow. It gets absorbed in that OH bond. It kind of stretches the OH bond in the water in that lattice. And so now all of a sudden the exclusion zone grows in response to infrared. Well, doesn't that make perfect sense? Because what does sunlight contain, 40 to 50% of all the time, right? Infrared light. And so we were designed, again, simplifying health, we were designed to be basically outside, exposing our bodies to infrared light from the sun the vast majority of the day in order to maintain this water battery inside of us that we've already talked about has the capacity to literally do all of our cellular work. And nowadays, living indoors, we're disconnected from this light. We're basically unplugged water batteries now. The modern window glass blocks the majority of it for energy efficiency in the building. The light bulbs have omitted it completely, again, for the energy efficiency of the building. But now we have an energy deficiency in the human. And it's because we're not exposed to these beautiful sources of infrared that we would normally would be.
Yeah, I think it's really actually kind of ironic that in our quest for energy efficiency within the tech world, we're creating this crisis of health completely out of ignorance. And I mean, in a lot of cases, I mean, there of course are some patents that may suggest that there is some knowledge of this information to a certain extent about the importance for human biology and how you can kind of hack into the dopamine system, for example, using things like blue light. But I think a lot of it is ignorance just due to a lack of mainstream research on the topic of light and how it's interacting with our biology. Um, and on one hand, you can kind of understand because since tech has been really taking off since, let's say, the electrical grid, late 1800s, things have just kind of gone out of control with regards to our tech development. It's just like we're worlds every year, like something incredible is coming out. And so the incentives aren't really in place to understand like, oh, maybe this is actually killing us or harming us and we shouldn't be doing this. But on the other hand, I think just being honest about the effects on our biology would allow us to build tech that could be more life affirmative, that's not harming us. So I think that's just really the first step we need to take. It's not like we can't use any of this stuff. There are ways to kind of use things more safely, but ultimately to develop tech like daylight computers doing,
Right.
making this computer that is actually working with our biology instead of against it, like that's just really the kind of the poster child for what is possible in the future, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. It's the ignorance. I think these companies don't realize it, and then there's no incentive, and who knows? I mean, there's potentially other issues at play there. But you're right. It's not only the light technology; it's the non-native EMFs as well. So that begs the question: then, what else about our living environment is depleting us beyond the light? And again, Wi-Fi exposure has been shown to prevent exclusion zones from building to their full capacity, meaning the exclusion zone is now about a 15 to 20% deficiency at all times when being exposed to Wi-Fi radiation. Well, who of us in this world is not exposed to Wi-Fi radiation? It's everywhere, right? And so you can imagine then the capacity of our cells to all of a sudden not have the same energetic capacity simply because of that. So now we have Wi-Fi depleting it. We've got the lack of infrared in our internal environments. We also have blue light, right? A really blue light dominant situation with the light sets coming from screens and bulbs. And that can have an inhibitory effect on mitochondrial water production. And so that's another place where we would essentially kind of replenish our intracellular hydration. And so now if our mitochondria aren't making the water, and also then the ATP and the infrared that mitochondria are designed to make for us, then now all of a sudden we're in this, again, it's like a triple whammy. The lack of the infrared, the overexposure to the blue light and the wireless radiation. This is a main reason why we're in such a depleted, energetically drained brain fog state. It's because we're not aware that these are impacting us on such a profound level.
Yeah, I think that's totally true and goes back to earlier you were talking about energy and information, and our bodies evolved or were designed to receive specific types of information from our environments, specifically within like the electromagnetic frequencies. So like the sun being the most dominant one, obviously we have the Schumann resonance and magnetic field of the planet. And so those are probably the three biggest ones. But now in the modern environment, we've kind of hacked into that EMF spectrum to reintroduce things that, you know, would typically be refracted by our atmosphere, so it wouldn't reach the planet, like the radio frequencies, for example. Like there's very, very small amounts that can reach the planet from outer space, but now we're like harnessing those frequencies to allow our tech to function, not realizing that it's providing information that's completely foreign to our biology. And with, you know, that information comes issues. Like if we're having new information coming in that our bodies aren't equipped to deal with, well, that's going to have major implications with regards to function and energy production and all those things. So I think, what are some of your biggest things you do or recommend for like EMF, non-native EMF, like mitigation or blocking?
Yeah, back in the day, this is my progression with non-native EMFs, and I know a lot of people in my community who are at kind of various, what I call it, various stages of EMF, fear, right? And rightly so, right? I don't want anyone to be afraid, but we need to be aware. that these are biologically confusing and kind of really biologically depleting. And back in the day, it's like, you know, I had the building biologist in and shield, shield, shield. What can I shield? How can I completely prevent any exposures? And I'm now realizing that can't be the method going forward. Yes, we want to shield if we can, right? But at the same time, you know, I think people need to just be very aware of the duration and the distance, right? How frequently we're basically have this little microwave device, right? You're basically a little microwave device, which is exactly what it is, in our hands or in our pockets or in our purses. How often are we doing that? So if we can decrease the duration that we're using that cell phone, I tell you, 9 times out of 10, the nervous system completely regenerates. I mean, our you know, nervous system completely rebalances itself. The mitochondria are able to finally get the correct signals, right? There's so much about just putting that little device down and away from our bodies. The other thing would be then also the distance too, you know, putting it away. The further we have these devices, then the less they're going to be able to get into our tissues. That's that inverse square law, the less biologically impactful they're going to be. I can't distance myself, however, from those satellites that are emitting it. I can't necessarily distance myself and shield myself always from those cell phone towers that are just getting put up willy-nilly all over, right? And so that's where I'm really appreciative of the work of people like Dr. Ibrahim Karim and biogeometry, because you go, oh yes, you got both of them. I love it. So exactly, right. It's you know, back in the day, if you would have told me that harmonizing EMFs was a thing, I would have been like, you're crazy, right? You're crazy. There's no way. But as I encourage people, you know, healthy skepticism and an open mind, right? Healthy skepticism and an open mind. If you actually start to dive into that research, you realize that these foreign waveforms that are really truly chaotic and confusing to the body can be manipulated in such a way that they can become biologically resonant, or at least biologically neutral. And so, and again, dive into the work of Dr. Ibrahim Karim and his daughter now carrying it forward, and Robert Gilbert, another lovely resource on that. And you can start to realize that we do have the potential, if we need to work with these waves and allow them to not be so depleting and draining for us. So those would be the strategies I use. And I don't want people to underestimate the fact that we do have some tools when it comes to harmonizing, but buyer beware, because you could get sold snake oil on that. And so I really encourage people to do their research when it comes to harmonizing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in people who are like really afraid and looking to like block, like you said earlier, and like even sleep in Faraday cages, I'm always like, I don't know about that, because you don't want to block the natural EMFs, like the natural magnetic field that becomes stronger at night that actually helps support your mitochondria and your sleep quality. And if you're sleeping in a Faraday cage, you're not getting access to the magnetic field of the earth either. Which is a problem. So we kind of have to toe this line of, you know, mitigating the non-native EMFs while allowing more of the natural EMFs into our life to help to naturally support our body's ability to handle stress in general. But for biogeometry, we've been dabbling in it for a few years now. I first heard about Ibrahim's work through Paul Chek, and I just had Angie Chek on my podcast, like I think an episode or two ago. But she's like really deep into biogeometry, and I've found it very fascinating. I haven't taken like the practitioner courses or anything yet. Have you dabbled into that?
I've taken several, not the biogeometry courses, the practitioner courses themselves. I've taken a lot of courses by Robert Gilbert that kind of toe the line between the subtle energies, like that would be, and how we can test them, how we can categorize them, basically the physics of quality from his lens. And he has a strong lens in biogeometry. You know, as you know, Dr. Kareem basically came up with a series of different wavelengths, have different color qualities to them, and those have different impacts on our body. So we can basically measure anything for what of those energies it's emitting. And we know, like, if it's got a ton of green, right, the horizontal, there's a certain wavelength frequency that is not biologically resonant. And then you could do things such as his Ibrahim's, you know, cubes and stickers and things like that that can help to harmonize a space. But the thing about this is that, and this is why I don't think a lot of people are aware of it, is because you can't just take a meter. Right. I can't just take a meter and show, oh, look, the EMFs are gone now, right? I shielded it and now they're less. because we're talking about taking a waveform that's still there, but essentially changing it and reshaping it. And that doesn't get picked up by a meter. So being able to use things like a neutral pendulum or the other pendulums and things like that, it's still too out. I think people think it's still just too woo and whack. When really this sort of thing has been around for thousands of years.
It has, and it's actually, so we have like the one, I think it's called the BG18 pendulum from
Yeah.
biogeometry. It has like a bunch of rings on it and has like a little tapered point at the bottom. And my
Mhm.
partner and I are both scientists. So of course, when we got the pendulum, like we want to test it. And so if it's over something that's exhibiting like the BG3 energy, like the unconditional love energy, it's supposed to spin clockwise. And then if it's above something that doesn't have that or has more negative green energy, it's supposed to spin counterclockwise. And so we, like the first day we got it, we were doing all these tests. Like we put it over our palm and then we'd quick pull our palm away and had it over like the trash can and it would spin the other way. We're like freaking out. Like it's actually detecting something. Like it's very real. We've tested it in many different scenarios. And also interestingly though, when you're wearing the biosignatures pendant, we've tested this on multiple people now. If you take a neutral pendulum over somebody's chakras who's wearing the biosignatures pendant, the pendulum is just dead still. It doesn't spin. And then if you take the biosignatures pendant off, it spins clockwise, you know, over the chakras in a way that's like proportional to the amount of energy that's in that chakra. But it's clearly doing something when it's interacting with the body. I don't know if it's creating like some sort of a shield or it's just like decohering the information that's traveling from your body to the pendulum, so it's not detecting it. I don't know, but it's really interesting. I'd love if you tried it too and see if you had the same
Yeah.
result.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna do that now. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's cool stuff, right? And like, and going back to just this concept of fear, and I know that I showed you the work a little while ago, Dan Winter, right? Which is a lot to take in. But, you know, his work has really shown that one of the worst things we can be is in a state of fear because we're beyond what we're talking about with the water and the light. We're literally being sustained by, you know, a life force energy, whether people, you know, want to, again, call it woo. Like I was such a quote unquote hard science person, right? Until I didn't need to be anymore, right? Until I started to open my mind up to new things. And we now know that it's the ether, right? We're literally being sustained by this life force from the quantum field, the ether that implodes into us, into our biofield. And fear changes how those waves implode. Fear essentially prevents the compression of this beautiful fluid-like entity called the ether. It changes how it can compress into us. So one of my what I can see is that people in a state of fear are fear and hatred, fear and anger. They're readily degenerating, and oftentimes, in spite of doing a lot of things perfectly, right? And so this is why I also always say, I want you to make your choices, never make your choices out of fear. It's always about making your choices out of, you know, gratitude or compassion as best as you can, because you're literally then changing how those waves can implode. And if we can live more in a state of compassion, gratitude, empathy, we actually then are harnessing our life force energy from the field more strongly. We're compressing it and distributing it way more efficiently. And that's called that's neg entropy. That's basically anti-chaos, right? That's self-reinforcing healing in our bodies. So people who are tending towards chaos and you know, aggressive aging or dis-ease, to me, I always look to their sources of fear and anger as well, because I know that plays a key role. And we know that fear and anger also changes the structure of the water inside of the body.
And I mean, that kind of ties in on the opposite end, like prayer, as, for example, like the healing abilities of that. And it's making me think of a story that my friend Elise Shunkowitz told, I think on this podcast, actually, like a year ago, about how she used to work at this, what was the hospital called? It's in New York. It's like this mental institution that's like very, maybe it'll come to me the name of it. But anyway, she was working there and she was like on a house call. Like basically they got called out to take this woman in against her will into the hospital because she believed that she could heal her cancer with prayer alone, and she was refusing treatment. And it's just like there's so much wrong with that, like on so many levels, that she would be forced to go into some sort of a mental institution for believing that. But on the other hand, I think it's important to talk about, you know, all of the cultures basically before ours always had some reverence for food and for life and engaged in regular prayer. And then my friend Rua Gilna also talks about going into prayer posture like your back is kind of over, your hands are forward, your chest is down. It automatically puts you into more of a parasympathetic state by allowing you to breathe more through your back. So you're expanding your lungs more, you're getting a better ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide due to like the Bohr effect and the way that oxygen diffuses into your bloodstream from your lungs. And so like there's so many benefits to engaging in that practice outside of like actually you're bringing presence, you're bringing gratitude. It's literally like changing your frequency. And yet as like this very mechanistic reductionist culture, we're just like kind of throwing everything out, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater essentially, because we think that we're somehow like better than that.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, that's what they did back then before they knew better. And it's like, gosh, I am, I am continuously returning to these ancient wisdoms and just so humbled by how much more they knew and applied than we do now.
Yeah, yeah. And also with regards to you were talking earlier about like the importance of not staying in fear and in anger. And I think something that I've really noticed by re-engineering nature into my life is, at least compared to grad school where I was under fluorescent or LED lights like the entire day long.
Mm.
I wasn't red pilled at all on this information. I would leave school every day just feeling burnt out, bitter, and just like fried, and always assumed that it was stress and like, you know, just the stress of having to work in the lab and the stress of having to work with animals, which I'm like a huge animal lover. So I did not enjoy that piece at all. Though when I worked with animals, I always like, if I had to sacrifice them, I would always pray over them. And actually, funny enough, I used to get the best, most reproducible data in the mice out of anybody in the lab. And my boss always trusted my data over other people's. And it's literally because I had reverence for these animals and I was very caring with them because I genuinely cared about them. And so, anyways, I thought it was just the stress of working in grad school. But then when I went back for my postdoc and I was starting to wear my blue blocking glasses and I was getting lots of sun, I was eating outside, I would leave the end of the day feeling fine. And I realized it was actually all the lights and EMFs in the environment that were basically poisoning me and burning out my nervous system, and that it doesn't have to be that way. If we were just to acknowledge what's going on, we could re-engineer that environment to be more harmonious with our biology. And yet we're kind of just in this very hypocritical state as well, because I like to tell the story of when I was doing some circadian work on mice in grad school. If I went into the mouse room at night, I could only turn on red lights in the mouse room because they know that like the bright white lights can impact their metabolism and change the data. And so I would turn on the red lights, check on my mice, and then I'd go back to my lab, blasting myself with fluorescent lights at like midnight.
Oh yeah, because it's just the mice that are affected by that, the blue light for
Exactly.
their metabolism, right? That's all. Oh, that's
Exactly.
funny.
Yeah, yeah,
I didn't know they did that. So I never worked with animals, so I didn't know that they actually did that
they
with the, so
do.
they know, so people know they
Yeah.
do it with mice, they do it with animals in their studies. Oh, that's so crazy. And we just don't apply it to humans because we don't need that, right? We're above that.
Exactly. But I mean, that's just to say that there's a lot that people can do to kind of re-engineer natural frequencies into their work environments, whether that's like actually working outside or getting better light sources in your room and like basically adding more red infrared back into it, and maybe even like more full spectrum bulbs as well. Anything else that you like to recommend that people do for their indoor environments to make them more
Yeah.
harmonious?
I mean, open your windows whenever you
Yes.
can, right? Like keep an open window. The amount of windows that I used to have in houses that just would never open, or if they didn't have a screen, so I was worried about animals or things coming in. It's like we open all of our windows whenever possible. So that makes a huge difference just to let that light in. And yeah, while you know, in a work environment, I actually say, if at all possible, just turn the lights off. Right. And then step outside periodically with your light breaks to get the brightness, right? Your brain does need that brightness signaling, not only the colors, right? The beautiful colors and the information we're getting from those, but the brightness effect as well to signal essentially time of day, and how alertness, if you will. So, you know, I would say that that's one of the most important things you can do. Just turn off the lights, mitigate your screen, take light breaks, you know, and by mitigate your screen, iris tech, there's other ways, you know, you can even simply, you know, it does a decent job for a lot of people to simply put the screen on night mode, like a really orange toned screen. You know, surprisingly, when I put my spectrometer to that, it actually, you know, it doesn't look too doesn't look too damaging when I see people use it that way. And so, yeah, just be aware that light's a thing, and the more you can get into the natural light unfiltered, the better. And the less you can contaminate your space with artificial stuff, especially the artificial stuff that contains the really strong blue, then the better, right? So it can be simple. It doesn't have to be insanely complex. I even had So I was buying groceries probably a few months ago, and it was an individual at one of these big box grocery stores, right? I was picking up a couple of things for like school supplies and things like that. So this big box store, and the cashier had very yellow toned glasses. And so I was like, oh, this is going to be an interesting conversation. And so I was like, so why do you wear those? And he was just like, he's like, well, I think he's like, I'm not sure, but I think it's all this fluorescent lighting. And I think the fact that we changed these really bright monitors for checkout, he said, it really started triggering my migraines. And he said, wearing these dark yellow lenses in this environment has completely taken them away. And I was like, obviously, right? Of course they have. I love that, but I'm so thrilled that he found that solution. So there's solutions like that, like wearing the yellow toned lenses as well, if you can't mitigate or have more of a natural lighting environment, as we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, I just remembered. So Elise, my friend, worked at Bellevue. That was the name of the hospital in New York, and she was also mentioning how like one of her friends would go out for like smoke breaks outside, and like there's this normalized, kind of uh structure in place that like if you smoke, you're allowed to get smoke breaks, but anybody else just wants to get a natural light break,
You
you're
look
kind of
weird.
out of luck. So maybe she would always joke like you're probably healthier by smoking and getting outside than the people who are trapped inside all day. But just like you said, taking natural light breaks as much as you can make a huge difference in the way that you're feeling at the end of the day and your circadian health. And so I think that's a really good one. And I get a lot of questions about like if I wear contacts and glasses outside, like what can I do about it? And like if you can pop them out or off whenever you're getting natural light exposure, that's ideal. I know Viva Rays also has like UV permeable glasses now. I haven't gotten them yet. I think I have a pair on their way, which I'm really excited to try, which is great if you can't happen to pop them off because you're doing something that you require your vision for. At least you're getting some of that full spectrum through. That your normal glasses and contacts would be blocking. Is it true that the Dailies contacts are permeable to UV?
Certain ones from the Dailies brand, yes. And do you know Dr. Valerie, she's an ophthalmologist who's actually trained in quantum biology. And so
Amazing.
she's made an entire list. I'll introduce the two of you. She's made an entire list of contacts that she's tested that actually are UV permeable.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, that's really good information because I get questions about that a lot. And I'm somebody who actually my vision has improved by one whole point in each eye since I started just having naked eyes more. So
Yep.
that's a great perk to that. But if you want to or need you to wear your contacts outside, using something from that list would be ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you talk about it a ton in terms of the POMC, and I mean, so many other aspects of how we need that UV signaling. Even though it's such a small portion, we need that UV signaling to optimize so many processes. So yeah, highly encourage, like you said, naked eyes first, and then we can check out those contact lenses, and maybe we can even find that list and post it somewhere in show notes or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely think we should do that. So, on the topic of water, do you want to talk about Mei Wan Ho's work a little bit? I think she's like a really incredible researcher within this field and contributed so much. So, if you want to touch on it, people might have heard her name in the quantum space. So I think it would be good to discuss her a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Mei-Wan Ho was an amazing researcher who really was startled on how water could bend light, basically, and how it created different lights. It changed light signaling she was studying like these little larvae, basically, right? And so, if you do a Google search, look up her book, The Rainbow and the Worm, because as she was studying and shining light on these little larval creatures, the water would change its shape, essentially, or its angle and its structure in order to bend the light, very much like looking at something moving through a prism, how the prism can bend the light. And so she basically figured out that it's the water and how the water can change its phase that bends the light and can change basically optical signaling all throughout the body. And so we know that cells are always emitting light. We know that the mitochondria emit light, right? But it's not just the light, it's the light and how the water can interact with it that bends it to signal it. She really jumped also on Gilbert Ling's work quite substantially in terms of, yes, just based on all of her studies, it can be as simple as the water and the behavior of water really animating all of our biochemistry. And so while biochemistry has been given such a, a podium upon which we can see a lot of research, it's what animates the biochemistry. And so she talked a lot about how even in redox reactions, where maybe a more traditional biochemical lens looks at the actual chemicals themselves as electron donors, she views the water itself as this, what she calls redox pile, right? Literally, because that water has a source of electrons and a source of protons, it can donate where and when needed to optimize things like oxidative stress and reactive oxygen signaling. And so, we can talk about any of those if you want to, but she really viewed the intersection between light and water's supreme ability to do so much in terms of optimizing our biochemistry.
Amazing. And how does Victor Schauberger's work fit into this too? And maybe we can talk about
Vortexing.
yeah, so let's talk about that, and maybe we can talk about the role of drinking water, and like, is drinking structured water more hydrating or beneficial to the body versus drinking just plain bulk water, for example.
Oh, I would say 100%, right? The number of people who have come to me and it's like, I think I mean, do you know the work of Dr. Batmangalej?
No.
Dr. Batman. Dr. Batmangalej was an Iranian physician during the revolution, and he got thrown in jail, right? So he got thrown in prison during the Iranian Revolution. And all he had access to, the guards would bring him fellow inmates, essentially, because they would come to him, oh, this person's got a migraine, this person's got angina, this person's got heart palpitations. And all he had access to was to give these prisoners more water. So basically, drink more water, drink more water. And he saw pain decrease drastically after about 3 glasses of water. And so he actually asked to stay in prison longer than his sentence because he was in literally a lab, right? A living laboratory where he could make these observations. And so after studying thousands of these situations in prison, he began to be like, what's the deal with water, and how is water so transformative in changing people's health? Well, he realized that one of the things that he realized that everyone is running around in a state of what he called chronic unintentional dehydration. I think that's the case for the vast majority of people that I see these days. They're chronically and unintentionally dehydrated. And when you are, that is reflected in essentially your blood volume. And that kickstarts a whole bunch of cascades we could talk about with cytokines and things that get released to trigger inflammation, trigger pain, right? That pain's a signal of chronic unintentional dehydration. And so that's where the water that we drink comes into play, because you have to ask yourself, are you holding on to that water? Does your body recognize that water as truly being water, right? Like we would get from a natural spring, and holding on to it and putting it into the blood volume to maintain healthy blood flow, healthy tissue status. And a lot of people say, oh yeah, well, I'm drinking a ton of water. Well, they're drinking tap water or reverse osmosis water. And I see those people, they're maybe drinking 2 liters of water a day, but they're peeing every 20 to 30 minutes. And meaning they're not holding on to any of that water. So when I have clients make the switch to water that is purified, structured, and remineralized, they actually need to drink a little less water, and because their body is holding on to that, their body recognizes that water as being truly what their biology needs, and so it's basically hoarding it and holding on to it. So the quality of the water we drink absolutely matters.
Yeah, I can attest to that as well. Back in grad school, before I knew anything about any of this stuff, I was drinking like a gallon of water a day. I was like very much like a gym bro at that point. And so I had a gallon. I would pick them up from Wawa, and it was like from a local spring, but I later found out that it wasn't just from the spring. They were treating it as well, which, is not ideal. But anyway, so I was drinking a gallon a day and I was peeing constantly. And when I started understanding more about the importance of mineralization and structuring, I went back and I tested that water, and it was like 40 parts per million of total dissolved solids. Like, it was super low, super low. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. Like, there's not enough minerals in here. And when we use reverse osmosis water, we also get like spring water as well to have both. But then we use the analemma one to structure it, and then we use like minerals to remineralize and everything like that. We also try to use like some direct sunshine as well occasionally, to help structure it. And I mean, I barely have to pee very much, maybe like once every couple hours or something like that, maybe once every 2 or 3 hours. So there's a huge difference. I can absolutely attest to that that's the case.
Well, yeah, it is. And so, I mean, and so then what happens with the water that we drink, I think is an important story for people to know, because the assumption is that the water that we drink, is what kind of flushes our cells. And I'm going to say what the water that we drink maintains a healthy blood volume. which is a signal, a good signal. There's a big connection between that blood volume shrinking and histamine and excessive histamine. So you see now, histamine's all the rage, right? I mean, everyone has histamine. Well, you're chronically dehydrated. And literally when you increase that blood volume back to healthy hydration, which I also use Quinton isotonic minerals as well to help support that. It's amazing how you can shut down a histamine response. So there's that. And so it goes to the blood volume. And then if the blood has adequate volume, then at the capillaries, that fluid can leak out at the capillaries and it can bathe the interstitial fluid, right? The space between the cells, which is also where our immune system lives. It's where our lymphatic system lives. Then it can penetrate into the cell as well. But I also like to highlight the fact that, water has to really hydrate all of these other spaces first before it's going to get into the cell. And so I say the true source of cellular hydration is the water that's being made at the level of the mitochondria. And so that's why that is such an emphasis for me, is optimizing mitochondrial efficiency and mitochondrial health. So, but this is equally important, in terms of making sure that the water is getting into the blood and into the interstitial space where we can get waste and nutrient exchange taking place. So the water that we drink, and you mentioned Victor Schauberger and his work. I mean, a lot of people don't recognize that water that we would have been consuming in nature moves, right? When it's coming from a spring, there's nothing that's ever stagnant, and it never moves through these straight lines and pipes like we see in municipal tap systems these days. And so when I do water crystallography, do you ever do Veda's technique, water
I haven't, but I've
crystallography?
been curious since you started talking about it to me. I'm really curious about it.
So you'll see a lot of examples of her and other people, but whenever I've done it too, just regular tap water, it doesn't form any structure, like any really pretty coherent structure. And so for those of you who don't know Veda, she essentially has her own proprietary method that she teaches of essentially lightly freezing water after it's been, in a petri dish. And you can expose that water to different things. And she's developed an entire method of kind of seeing the messages that can be arranged in the structure of that water. It's a really cool thing. But what I've done with tap water, it literally looks dead. It kind of it's like amorphous, no shapes really form. Whereas when you do water crystallography on natural spring water, you'll see these beautiful ferns and these hexagons. And those are symbols of like living natural water. It looks very vibrant and healthy. And so that's why, a lot of what's taking place these days is the municipal tap system is not only putting toxins into the water, and yes, you might have a reverse osmosis that's taking the toxins out, but it's doing nothing to enhance the structure or the information and the energy that's inside that water. And so what vortexing can do is it can essentially impart both structure and energy to the water. A vortex is designed to implode energy and information. And through that implosion, then that gets distributed. So the world is always full of these toroidal flows, right? Like you have an implosion and then a distribution or an explosion. And when you implode something, you're gathering energy and information, and then you're distributing it to the water. So a vortex is a great way to change the structure and the energetic quality of the water you drink. And Victor Schauberger completely led the way in our understanding of that. But yeah, vortexing water, taking that water from your tap, filtering it, vortexing it, and then remineralizing it can go a long way towards reestablishing healthy water. That is the water that our body wants to absorb. And when I've done crystallography on tap water before and after doing something like that process, that water all of a sudden starts to create those beautiful geometric shapes again. So tap water, kind of dead, denatured, if you will, even traumatized, and then you allow it to come back to this vital state. It's really cool to see happen, and it makes sense as to why then my body wants to absorb and utilize that water, because of the information that I'm consuming, not just the fact that it's water. I don't want to consume water that's kind of got dead or traumatized information in it. I want to consume water that has the vital energy and information for my body.
That's incredible. And do we need to know anything about like implosion angles to do that? Or how do you recommend people vortex their water, essentially?
Yeah, no, I've tested so many water vortexers from many different companies, and I have a product recommendations guide if anyone wants to know on my website that has all of those that I've tested, and all the ones that are listed on my site. And those are all the ones I've tested. Actually change the water for the better, right? They improve the structure and the energetic qualities of the water. Now, There are angles of implosion that might be optimum, right? That actually build on the phi ratio. And so you can picture almost like a phi spiral, if you will, coming in through a vortex cone. But it doesn't have to be that specific. And even actually, believe it or not, doing this to the water, right? Just a gentle vortex that you create in your glass has the ability to enhance it. Now, it's not the same as maybe putting it through a true imploder, but at the same time, even that, because water likes to move, water wants to swirl, and it doesn't want to be stored in these big vats and traumatized with chemicals and pipes. And so even if you store a little bit of movement to your water, it's going to enhance the absorbability.
Does it matter if it's clockwise or counterclockwise?
Um, Well, so the only reason I'm going to say yes is just because do you know Robert Gourlay?
No.
He's been studying water for probably 35 years. He has a company, MEA Water, magnetized, energized, activated water. And he uses vortexes, but he's got one of these ones that attaches two bottles together, and there's a magnet in between, and it vortexes it. So you fill the bottom with water, and then you leave the top one empty, flip it over. And he always said, there you go. Yeah. I love this as like
Girl Steiner team.
girls on your team, right? So you essentially then, he always says to spin that one in a counterclockwise effect. And so he says that imparts more charge into the water. You can impart health, you can gather more charge into the water. So that's my only opinion on that one. It would have to be someone like Robert that you would discuss more deeply with. But yeah, no, I mean, I would say, and I don't know, maybe I guess I'm right-handed, so I naturally vortex it in that direction anyways.
Yeah, well, I noticed when I was using the Analemma one when I first got it, I naturally was stirring counterclockwise, but then I thought maybe they said, or I read somewhere that, oh no, it should be clockwise, or maybe I just thought, oh, because like with your pendulums, if they're spinning clockwise, that's a good thing. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna spin it clockwise, but it doesn't necessarily feel natural. I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe we can try both and we can test it with the
Right.
crystallography.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah. And maybe it's different with like the subtle energy or the ether versus the water, right? Maybe there's a little bit of a
Yeah.
mirror image to each other. I don't know. Yeah, something like that.
That's true. So I remember reading about water. Like if you look at the ocean, it looks blue because water can absorb essentially all frequencies of light from the sun except blue. So it reflects blue. Do you have any thoughts on color and water? Because I know there's like a lot of like blue bottles out there that people will like charge up their water in. I'm just thinking about it because if anything, I would think actually water doesn't want to be blue because it's reflecting me.
Right, like plants, like why plants don't
Yeah.
absorb green is because that
Right,
color green is actually harmful to them,
right,
right?
right.
It's against photosynthesis. So yeah, I've got a couple of, yeah, well, I mean, I've tested things. I've got a couple opinions on that as well. Robert, again, is the expert when it comes to that because healthy water, does take on a bit of a bluer quality to it. And so just FYI on that. But in terms of the actual storage containers with the water will take on the energy and information of the actual container. It absolutely will. And when you look into color theory, you can see that there's a different maybe emotional states or different things associated with different colors, or the chakras, if you will, associated with different colors. And so I always tell people to pick the one that resonates the most with them, which is the one where they subjectively look at that color and it brings them joy or gratitude or excitement, whatever emotion that might pop up that is more subjectively pleasing. And then put your water in that if you want, and just see. And when I've done water crystallography, I've done it on Myron glass, I've done it on the Blue Bottle Love. I mean, I think water just likes to be tended to because when I do the water crystallography on it, it always shows beautiful structure, regardless. I haven't tested all different colors, but yeah, I would say that I think water really especially likes that blue color, and maybe in a similar way, it feels like it doesn't have to absorb that energy. It can reflect that energy, right? And it can
Yeah.
take on other energy and information.
I think that makes sense. So maybe one final thing with water. Are there any, you mentioned the ketone isotonic. Are there any specific minerals that you recommend to be in water that like people should add into their drinking water, for example, or even the water that they're bathing in?
Yeah, the interesting thing about this is that, and people kind of like to pick fights on this, with social media and stuff. And it's just like, well, that's not your main source of minerals, right? You don't need to remineralize your water because that's not your main source of minerals. And that's absolutely correct. It's not your main source of minerals. However, the water that the minerals are required because they have a slight charge to them, right? They're required to help us better absorb that water. And I always say, because water in a natural setting contains an earth-based source. So as that water's bubbling up through a spring or something along those lines, it's going to gather up all of the minerals that it passed through. So I like people to put in a full spectrum natural source of minerals into their water, whether it's a little bit of sole, like a couple drops of sole, which is dissolved sea salt, like a dissolved Celtic sea salt. I like, there's various humic and fulvic minerals, which are also earth-based minerals. And again, it's not because I'm telling people that that's their main mineral source, but that's going to be biologically resonant. The body's going to be like, I know what that mineral blend is. I know what those minerals are, because they come from nature. And so again, that's another, basically more information that we're imparting into that water to help our body want to pull it in. So sole-based minerals, quinton minerals, which are an ocean mineral, yeah, the fulvic, the humic minerals, all of those can be great options.
Cool. And is there a specific TDS that you will target for water? So like I typically shoot for around like 150 parts per million or more, but like minimum 150. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Absolutely. And I tell people at that point, if they've reached that point and they want to go higher, go based on taste. Because
Yes.
some people like a little bit, maybe if they're using a salt-based mineral, some people like a little bit more, and it means they need it. And oftentimes these people are experiencing symptoms of low blood pressure, POTS, histamine issues and stuff. So really people can go at that point based on taste.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, I personally noticed that I have like a taste for a specific amount of minerals in my water relative to some other people in my house. So it's really easy to just like titrate up or down depending on what you're drinking. You can just add, a couple more drops of whatever mineral is so you're using to help make it palatable for you, because again, that's likely information coming from your body about what it needs and what
Exactly.
it wants. So if it tastes too salty or it doesn't taste good, you probably need to cut back or, increase if you feel like you need a little bit more. So I think that's really good advice. Anything else on water that you want to mention?
Oh gosh, I mean, I could talk about this all the time, right? But I'll hours and hours and hours more about this. But no, this is great, Alexis. Thank you. I think we just really touch on so many important things, and I just really appreciate this conversation.
Me too. So maybe one final question. Do you not recommend reverse osmosis, or do you use it as long as it's remineralized, restructured, and then it's
Yeah, you can always return water back to a vital state, right? So reverse osmosis, distillation, or just filter to the best of your economic ability, or even right? Even if it's quote unquote just a Brita pitcher, still filter it, or else you're going to become the filter. So go ahead and filter that water. But yeah, reverse osmosis is fine. It's just again devitalized water, and we need to. And here we like this is we didn't touch on this, and this is a whole other podcast in and of itself, but healing intention works through changing the structure of water so that it has more energy, right? So you'll see literally studies being done by people like Dean Radin, who will take like a distilled water drop and measure the energy around it, the plasma of energy around it, very much like our own plasma biofields. And you'll see that this distilled water has like a very small plasma around it, meaning it doesn't have a lot of life force energy, not a lot of charge. And then all of a sudden they just send healing intentions to this one little water droplet. And then, after 10 minutes, they take another picture of it. And that charge around it, that plasma around it is just, quadrupled or even more so than that. And so don't underestimate the power of healing intention or intention that you can put into the water in order to, again, enhance the quality and the vitality of that water that we're drinking. Also, I think, like you said, that's like prayer, right? That's going to enhance our own body of water as well.
Yeah, I think that's just so important for everything. Like wherever you're putting your attention and your intention is like where energy is flowing, and like that's part of you that's going into the thing. Like whether it's paying attention or putting intention into your relationships or to some house plants you have or pets or your water, like or your own body, like it's actually vitalizing it just through that mechanism. And I mean, some just as like a basic story to kind of highlight this before we wrap up is I had this beautiful CBD plant growing in my house. I got a seed from like some flower that we bought and I sprouted it, and it was a beautiful plant, and it was growing really nicely. I was always talking to it and like loving it, and it was just a really great plant. And then I bought some like succulents from a local store and I brought them into the house. And then life got busy and I noticed like the cannabis plants just started looking like not so great over time. And like the leaves started getting nutrient burn and stuff. And I was like, what's going on? And one day, like I actually had some downtime and I went over to the plant and I looked really, really close at the plant and I saw there were like these spider mites all over it that were like infesting the plant that had come apparently from the succulents because I found them all over the succulents as well. That's something I wouldn't have noticed unless I actually like paid attention, like close attention and like went up to the plant and actually looked at it. But I feel like that's just like an anecdote that applies to everything in life. Like you actually it can't just be an afterthought. Like you need to put your awareness on the thing and then maybe things will be revealed to you about what's going on there and then you can potentially do something about it. So I think like you said, water likes to be tended to.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
just paying some attention and putting your awareness into the water that you're drinking and to your own body and the water that your body's making
Sure.
can make a world of difference.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, William Tiller was a wonderful scientist at Stanford who showed that focused human attention compresses energy fields, compresses charge. So essentially, you, like you said, where your attention goes, you have the ability to put more energy or more information into something. That's powerful. And so that means that you and your water can have a beautiful relationship. I've had one client who literally healed herself through that relationship with water of nine, I won't say nine, but at least half a dozen diagnosed autoimmune conditions and autoimmune markers, simply through changing her relationship with water and understanding how her focused attention could imprint the water essentially and could help heal her body. So we're not taught the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the powers that we have and how we can interact with things in our world. And water is a really cool way to start. It's like a gateway into that. Highly encourage Veda's courses and her technique because it really allows you to start to see how water can shift and change in response to different stimuli.
Beautiful. And maybe we can wrap up by you can tell people how they can find you and work with you. I know you have a lot of offerings and ways that people can be in your space. So if you want to share about it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So Instagram's a great hub if you kind of just want to dip your toes into this, right? I typically post multiple times a week about water and light and ether and earthing and grounding and nature and things like that. And then I also my website, so Instagram's Carrie B Wellness. Website is carriebwellness.com. I've got courses for individuals looking to learn this information to help heal themselves. I've got courses for practitioners as well. All my courses are pay what you choose. So I want this information to be accessible to as many people as possible. So please go there if this interests you and start learning about it. I have a whole course specifically on water for practitioners, and I've got 2 different master classes on water, the easy water masterclass and the hydration masterclass for those who are looking to dive into this more for an individual healing basis.
That's amazing. And do you work with people one-on-one or not really?
I do, but that list is quite substantial, and so there's a big, fairly long wait on that. And so, if anyone wants additional support, I love I do 3.5 hours of live Q&As every week in my private community. So you feel free to join that. You can ask multiple questions, and I can start to get to know you. I've worked with so many people just through that alone, and I've seen some life-changing things in that community. So feel free to hop on there. You also get the support of other people who have been doing this and been absorbing and interacting with this information. So that's always a lovely thing too.
Amazing. Carrie, thank you so much. This was so fun. I feel like we could
Thanks.
probably have a podcast series at this point. I think we could probably go on for hours. So maybe we should make it happen again at some point. But I want to thank you so much for your time. This was really fun, and I'm excited to connect more in the future.
Absolutely, Alexis. I'm same. I'm so excited to continue our chats together. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to connecting with you again.
Thank you.